and we are ready to welcome Dr. Alan Wolfelt among us. Welcome, Dr. Alan Wolfelt. I would like to introduce our audience to Dr. Alan Wolfelt. I had the honor of having one of my first trainings in grief with him in Sudbury, kind of 10 years ago. Dr. Alan Wolfelt has been recognized as one of North America's leading death educators and grief counselors, recipient of the Association of Death Education and Counseling's Death Educator Award. He serves as the director of the Center for Loss and Life Transition in Fort Collins, Colorado. He is also a faculty member of the University of Colorado Medical School's Department of Family Medicine. In addition to presenting dozens of keynotes and workshops across North America each year, Dr. Wolfelt facilitates training seminars for bereavement caregivers in Fort Collins and Scottsdale. Dr. Alan Wolfelt is a popular media resource who regularly provides his expertise to many top-tier television shows, newspapers, and magazines. He is also the best-selling author of more than 50 books, including When Grief is Complicated, a model for therapists to understand, identify, and companion grievers. Okay, and this is all about the topic of Dr. Alan Wolfelt today, and will also be the complimentary book to you. Every conference attendee who will be watching us today and send their contact information to us. So welcome, Dr. Alan Wolfelt, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. What a privilege to be invited to be with you today. It's an honor. You know, a very wise person once observed that there's always two parties to a death: the person who dies and those who are bereaved. As we come together this morning, virtually, I remind you that bereavement literally means to be torn apart and to have some very special needs. It is, in fact, my honor to share my passion for grief caregiving with you today as we explore some of the very natural complications that come with grief. And I'm going to make sure that I get my remote working here. There we go. Well, just as love is complex and complicated, I would remind us all that so too is grief. The very nature of grief can make it profoundly challenging and chaotic. As I'm sure you all know, change is inherently chaotic. All change, in fact, starts often with elements of chaos and complications. And I remind us that grief will keep demanding our attention, of course, until we give it the attention that it very much deserves. Let me give you one brief introductory illustration that we'll return to later in my time with you today. When he was 9 years old, his mother died by suicide. And immediately the family rule became never mention the word suicide. In other words, it was a closed family system. There was no ceremony to initiate grief, the internal response to loss, and any form of mourning, the shared social response, reminding you that ceremony is not a rite of closure, it's a rite of initiation. Dad then removed all linking objects that connected him to his mother, and then Dad remarried 4 months later to a neighbor lady, brought her home and said, call her mother. The family moved 10 months after the death, and the family secret prevailed. Again, a closed family system whereby this 9-year-old was set off on a path of being able to grieve internally, but to in no way break family rules that would allow for mourning. And again, I'll return to him later when we talk about unembarked grief or mourning. Well, the reality is, in my experience now of 40 years, that few helping situations are more challenging, yet at the same time, I hope you would agree, more rewarding than the opportunity to assist people who are impacted by life losses, transitions, reminding us all that from the moment of birth, life is a series of transitions, of griefs, of losses that, of course, anytime we gain something new, we're giving something else up. As you also know, the topic of this workshop, that I have the privilege of being with you this morning, or this afternoon, depending on your time zone, is complicated grief, which is an interesting use of a term because, as we'll all acknowledge, grief is naturally complicated, if you will. But I remind us that for some in mental health, that's a term that's used as a diagnosis of a pathology, a mental illness, a disorder that somehow needs to be treated or cured. Well, let me remind you that recently it was announced that prolonged grief disorder will be added to the newest version of the DSM-5 TR manual. Matter of fact, that'll be occurring this next month. So how appropriate that we're going to be able to explore this important topic as it relates to your conference theme, sustaining quality amid change. In this workshop, I'm going to challenge the use of this pathology-based model of understanding of what to me is a very normal, organic, and natural state. I do agree that we do need models of understanding that allow us to identify, and I will advocate to companion, not treat out of a medical model, those experiencing grief who need and deserve at times additional support. In other words, one of the most important things for all of us as caregivers to know is at times when to refer. And I'll help you make a distinction between providing grief support or counsel to people, which many people do very well with, versus at times when we have understanding that people might need additional help and move into a more therapeutic model, if you will. And I'll make, again, that distinction. However, I'm going to advocate that pathologizing grief, it often implies that something is wrong with you if you don't grieve in the right way and for the right length of time. After 40 years of having the honor of discovering my passion in my teen years, of supporting thousands of children and teens, adults, families who are grieving the death of someone in their lives, and of course with the pandemic we've recently experiencing, I believe for all of us as caregivers, regardless of your specific role, be it physician, counselor, social worker, chaplain, regardless of our role, I believe now more than ever is a time to understand what it means to be grief informed. What an obligation and what a dangerous opportunity for us, particularly again right now. I'm going to go on, of course, to advocate that grief is not an experience that needs to in any way be silenced or actually treated. Treat, I remind you, comes from the Latin root word tracture, which literally means to drag. If you were to combine that with patient, I'd remind you, if you look it up in Webster's, it means passive long-term sufferer. So think about that a moment. Treat patients, drag, passive long-term sufferer. I'd remind you that's the last thing that someone in grief really ultimately needs in terms of our support and our being present to them and creating holding environments. So again, I want to advocate in this presentation that grief is not an experience that needs to in any way be silenced or treated, or in fact, related to our specific topic, pathologized. Instead, I'm going to suggest that grief and the multitude of natural complications that it brings to the experience needs and deserves support, compassion, and perhaps most of all, for us to wrap our arms around each other and provide a sense of community to people who encounter loss in their lives. I guess I need to acknowledge that you're learning today, I hope from me, might need to own that I'm kind of known as a responsible rebel within the area of death education and counseling. And I say that with humility, but I want to own that rebels aren't afraid to question established structures and forms. And at the same time, it's very important that rebels respect the rights of others to use different models of understanding. And I can only teach what I have experienced. And so I'm not going to teach you a pathology-based model, but talk more about, of course, the natural complications that are inherent to grief, and then provide you a model of understanding that I think can be helpful to you in your caregiving role. Again, what a privilege to be with you. I also encourage you to know that you have the opportunity to post questions that we'll make use of during our question and answer period of time. And I'll be highlighting some areas that you may want me to expand upon that in the context of my time with you, I've made a decision to be fairly concise, but invite you to have me expand on it if time allows. So again, thank you. So let's, Voltaire once said, if you wish to converse with me, define your terms. So in my own writings and teachings, at our training center, I talk about how I define complicated grief as grief that's stuck or somehow strayed off course and is not softening over time, instead becoming entrenched or actually worse. So when I say complicated grief, I'm acknowledging that we've identified some complication that we need to give attention to, but I always believe and remember, people are doing the best they know to do. We want to be very careful with how we frame that up as we develop care plans for them. I will be going on, and I'd like to introduce now very briefly that I'll be talking about, as I develop care plans, only for the purpose of doing just that. I often identify 4 major subcategories that identify people that might benefit, if they so choose, from additional support and help. So I'll be talking about unembarked grief, impasse grief, off-trail grief, and encamped grief. Again, I can't emphasize enough, I only use these frameworks to give me a sense of what I'm going to do as I develop what I'm going to do to assist somebody. Naturally complicated, people doing the best they know what to do, but we want to be very careful that we're not contaminating with a biomedical model of pathologizing what people are experiencing. I'll talk more about that. So complicated grief is an understandable response to often quite naturally challenging loss circumstances and additional risk factors that I'll walk you down through. In fact, I'll be walking you through 12, and that'll be an area I'll invite you, if you wish, for me to expand on any of those risk factors. So let's first and foremost acknowledge some of what I call in my teaching some foundational principles. All grief is normal and it's necessary. It's our capacity to give and receive love, I often say, that require the necessity to mourn. Secondly, we know that grief is often, by its nature, complicated and unique to each and every one of us as fellow humans. For a variety of reasons, some people, and we'll talk about those reasons, some people experience naturally extra complicated grief. And I would acknowledge that any number and combination of extraordinary loss circumstances and risk factors can contribute. Now, having said that, I'd remind us that to be human means loss will occur. As I mentioned earlier, from the moment of conception, life is a series of transitions, of griefs, of losses, that anytime we gain something new, we give something else up. All people, I'd remind us, regardless of gender, nationality, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status, will experience loss and hopefully the need to take grief and allow it to become authentic mourning. Now, you see exception. I remind you, our capacity to mourn is based on our capacity to attach. Sadly, the reality is that some people suffer from challenges with regard to attachment. People who have severe character disorders often have ability to attach. An illustration I often think of is I had the honor of supporting several families who, sadly, their daughters were killed by Ted Bundy, a notorious serial killer. And I often think of how Ted Bundy was not a candidate for grief counseling. He could take a life, go down the way, take another life, and feel no sense of culpability. Have you noticed how we sometimes overuse the term, all grief is a universal experience? Well, I just remind all of us today, I so much wish, as I hope you do too, that it was. But in fact, it's not. So I remind you, be careful with the use of all, grief being universal, because if somebody in fact does have difficulties with attachments, has a character disorder, they can sometimes, again, take a life, go down the street, and feel no sense of any culpability related to that. So the ability to love and to be loved, what a precious gift it is, to open your heart, your well of reception, and to allow others in. And then to know that if they precede you in death, you're going to come to grief and going to need to find safe people and safe places that allow and encourage open, authentic mourning. So another foundational principle is that the symptoms people use, which I like to frame for myself as these people are using signals or symptoms to care elicit around things that we need to help them give attention to. So those signals, again, the reason I use signals is to kind of allow myself to get outside the medical model of assess, diagnose, and treat. And so the word symptom originates there. So if you think about, people give us signals. they're shocky, they're disoriented, they may have protest emotions, they may need to do some regret review. They may have the hallmark of grief, of sadness, being pressed down, needing to do what Carl Jung years ago called soul work, downward movement in your psyche. Well, those are only a few of many potential signals that people give. And these signals of complicated grief are often the same as very normal symptoms of grief, but they often differ, as I'll go on to teach, in terms of at times their degree, their feature prominence, their functional impact on us as human beings. And sometimes, we want to be very careful with that, using linear models that say, okay, it's normal, but until this day, you now have pathological grief. But sometimes duration issues do come into play in the model that I've developed over the years and that we've used extensively at our Center for Loss. So in determining where to draw the line between, quote, what often gets referred to as normal grief and complicated grief, to me, the most important question is, would this fellow human being, would this person likely benefit from compassionate, professional at times, companionship, keeping in mind that many people don't necessarily require or need, quote, professional companionship. We historically in our community surrounded people with their friends and their families. We didn't have clinical thanatologists like myself that specialize in complicated grief. And in fact, if you go back and look historically, we didn't really need that because of the ways in which we were able to support each other. So I'd remind you today, much of what I teach is not what's new, it's what we used to do that we socioculturally in part have lost. And I'd be glad to expand on or talk more about that, so should you so choose. So another thing I think foundational before I jump into talking about naturally complicated grief is at our training center where people choose to spend, what an honor, 150 hours of time with me over 5 30-hour trainings. We always sit down initially with them and we take a look at the essential ingredients to someone who might use their life gifts to support people around end of life or bereavement caregiving. And I thought you might find it helpful if we could go through some of those ingredients, and you can reflect personally on whether you're kind of congruently matched to doing what you're doing, or particularly in this context, doing grief care. So a man by the name of Combs years ago in the helping literature, he talked about the concept of self as instrument. And essentially what he was referring to is there a congruent match between your core values and who you are and what it is you're going to be doing. Several months ago, I was speaking in Atlanta and a social worker walked up to me and said, well, this social worker wouldn't be so bad if I didn't have to work with people. And of course, I hope you chuckle at that in the sense that that was somebody who just actually went on to teach me they were on the edge of burning out and needed some renewal time and some discernment related to their self-care. But when you lose an understanding, or have you ever heard that saying, I used to be a people person until people ruined it for me? In other words, as we go through our time together in this presentation with you, I want you to be holding the mirror up and asking yourself, are you, and I imagine many of you are, but our role as people who mentor people is to suck people in and at times select people out where it's just not a congruent match. And it doesn't mean they're not a good person. It just means this isn't for them. As many of you know, if you tell people what you do, they'll say, oh my, why would you want to do that? Isn't that depressing? When for many of us, this is a calling, it's a congruent match, and it's a good use of yourself as instrument. I never forget when I wrote my own personal mission statement at 16 that I wanted to have a center for loss and help children, teens, and families. My dad, who I shared it with on a napkin, said, well, Alan, you know, you've always been pretty sensitive, even as a baby, you were sensitive. I can see you doing this. And to me, well, that's a simplistic example. It was affirming that it was a good match of who I am as a person. The second ingredient is to take inventory of your core conditions of helping that aren't really something we can do empathy-based training early on in life, but sadly, we often wait till you go to graduate school and say, do you have empathy? Many of you know that back in the 1950s and 60s, numerous studies were done that showed you could have a body of knowledge, be bright, have skills, but if you were low on core conditions, you wouldn't be naturally therapeutic or helpful, if you will. And so when we think of empathetic relationship qualities, we look at not only the major triad of genuineness, empathy, and warmth, but I actually have talked about a number of other qualities like immediacy, Actually, having a sense of humor helps you survive when you work in end-of-life care, keeping it backstage and appropriate. But I often have my students inventory about 10 qualities that I think are critically important to inventory. And if you're going to teach them, we should teach them to preschoolers, not wait until you're in later life and say, by the way, do you have these? It's too late, actually. The third area that I want to emphasize is where I'm going to be having the honor of giving attention to you here today. And that is exploring some of the mysterious body of knowledge around complicated grief. We have an obligation, if we're going to companion people, to know about what we call the mysterious body of knowledge. And I use the word mysterious consciously because mystery means something to be pondered, not explained. Never think of yourself as a grief expert. I mean, I'm sometimes introduced as one of North America's leading death experts, and it kind of frightens me because to my knowledge, I haven't died. Do I have a compassionate curiosity to learn how to be of help to my fellow human beings, to companion them, not treat them? Yes. But I need to stay humble and know I'll never arrive and always continue to learn from the best teacher, the person who's walking that walk. So to anchor that learning, that's where we're going to be giving attention and our focus to here today, a mysterious body of knowledge specific to complicated grief. But as an example, we could choose a multitude of other topics related to the body of knowledge in grief care, but today that's where we're giving attention. The next ingredient I would add is that, you know, I never know what I'm going to say, and I think that's a good thing. I'd be working from some expert model if I did, but I have had good mentorship in developing advanced level counseling skills. I have a pretty large toolbox that I can draw upon, but always remembering that my responses come from what that fellow human teaches me they might find of help from me. And I think that's anchored in advanced level counseling skills. Sometimes I'll meet people who've studied the body of knowledge, but they struggle because they haven't learned the 10 foundations of deep listening skills, how to clarify, perception check, how to use leading, which is really misnamed because it's following, how to be empathetically responsive, how to use at times supportive confrontation. The list goes on, but I just encourage any of you out there who've never been taught or mentored in the area of advanced level helping skills to please consider that. And then the last ingredient is having discernment around our self-care, to know that there is risk for burning out or having what for years we called compassion fatigue, and then we burned out on the use of the term, and now it's called vicarious traumatization. Call it what you like. But my friends, my colleagues, be aware of the importance of having boundaries and going away and having other hobbies and interests. I have encouraged my students to, when they're on vacation, to tell a little white lie. What do you do? I often use, I sell life insurance, and they run away from me and don't speak to me as I'm trying to renew my spirit, my soul, so that when I'm with people, I can have that high level of immediacy, of presence to them, and access 3 levels of the interaction: exchange of content, exchange of emotion, and exchange of meaning. 3 levels that you should always be able to enter into in a helping relationship. So I hope that was helpful to you to just review the ingredients and to acknowledge that what we're going to be focusing on is the body of knowledge from my perspective, I own, as it relates to my writings and teachings about natural complications of grief. Well, in review then, as we transition here, complicated grief is not an illness or a disorder in my perception, but instead a normal human response to naturally complex life and loss circumstances. Yes, complicated mourners need help, but I want to advocate that they don't need treatment, they need care, not cure. So I invite you to take a look at and reflect on the distinction between caring and curing. As we, for a variety of reasons, have lost wisdom about grief and the need to mourn, the tendency's been to push mourners forward, unfortunately, because remember, the instinct in loss is to go backward before forward. Kierkegaard is right. Well, life must eventually be forward. It's understood and given meaning to backward. But in this context, as we've lost wisdom about grief and the need to mourn, the tendency is to push the mourner forward with cure instead of care. So let's look at that distinction. Cure literally means to eradicate an illness. But here's the challenge in that. Grief is not an illness. It's only as we've lost wisdom that we begin to treat it as such. and move from communal responses of supporting to more seeing an individual who we use a criteria of symptoms to decide whether something's normal or pathological. So grief isn't an illness, it's a normal response to being torn apart. Curing, in contrast, then is a medical term that means remedying or correcting, where caring is really, in fact, about honoring the transformation of one's heart and of one's soul. Caring, in fact, is about being a companion navigator out of the darkness and into the light. That always reminds me of how for years, since I started my center years ago, above my desk reads the following, and I read it every morning before I see an individual or a family. Just remind me of a sequence issue. And what that reflection is darkness is the chair upon which light sits. People don't come into a center for loss because metaphorically they're in the light. They come in because they're in the dark, and they may say things like, I'm not sure I'd mind it if I didn't wake up tomorrow. And of course, a companion will enter into what someone thinks and feels without thinking their job is to change it, and to know that people come in because they're in the dark, and that's where you start. If you try to bring light to someone who's in dark, you just create distance and separation in the context of that holding environment. So no surprise, we have a multitude of people struggling with complications of grief. Well, you might pose the question, well, why is that? Why do we know that we, in part, I believe, have an epidemic of people who carry grief and through no fault of their own often don't get to convert that into what I like to call authentic mourning, grief gone public, shared response to loss. Well, in these contemporary times, one of the contributors to complicating people's grief is that many people are often told things like, be strong. When I remind you what we really need is, in fact, to be vulnerable, to stand under our grief, to surrender to our grief. I have written a book called Understanding Your Grief, but in the introduction, I acknowledge the white lie that people who are in publishing business, tell you that people will decide to buy a book instantly by the title and the look. And I originally entitled the book Standing Under Your Grief because I believe you do have to be vulnerable and know that's more powerful than you. It's the most humbling experience in your life. So I had to acknowledge in the introduction that I mistitled it so you'd purchase it, because I'm going to teach you there's things about grief that we don't understand. It's a mystery. It's something to be pondered, not always explained. But here, think about how many times people are told, be strong. You know what? The initiation of us to mourning requires that we stand under, or we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, taking our grief, allowing it to become mourning. We're often told things like, think positive. Of course, what we really need to do is to be able to befriend the pain of life losses. Hard to do in North American culture, where many people, not all, don't generalize it, have lost an understanding of the role of hurt, pain, and suffering, who think they have some right to go around grief, to not experience it. But I teach and talk a lot about the need to understand the normalcy of what is the role of hurt in our healing. And if we try to avoid that, then we self-treat it, we try to go around it, all sorts of things. Think how many times you may have yourself personally been told, now stay positive, things could be worse, and then get bucked up as a consequence of that, which we're notorious for culturally. Carry on, keep your chin up, keep busy. And what about how many people are greeted with the uniquely North American message of seek closure, when I remind you, what we really need is to welcome our natural and necessary grief. I'd remind you the use of that semantic closure. It's unique to North America. Other cultures, if you study cross-culturally to learn about grief, which I highly recommend in this mosaic of the world we live in, they don't even use the word closure. They have series of ceremonies, they have days of the dead, and they never say, have you reached closure? And tie it to some linear model. Many people are told, have you had closure? Are you over it? Have you let go? What an inappropriate semantic. If you want somebody to hold on to grief, tell them to let go. One of the many paradoxes of grief, if you will. Speaking of paradoxes, another macro contributor to why we're witnessing a lot of people with carried grief and complicated grief is tied to what I've termed the paradoxes of mourning, looking at 3 forgotten truths. So let me very briefly introduce it and inspire you, maybe if you want to learn more, to explore the topic. But I was sitting in my writing hut just a few years ago, and I said, what's my next book? And I said, I think I'll write about how there's been a reversal in three things in our culture that I want to speak to briefly, because I think they're a major contributor to our complications of grief. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves, a paradox is a seemingly self-contradictory statement or situation that is in fact often true. So let me first acknowledge the three truths, and then we'll kind of look at how they've been reversed in our culture. So one truth is, and it is a truth, you must say hello before you say goodbye. Truth number two, you must make friends with the darkness when loss enters your life before often you can see light again, metaphorically speaking. And truth number three that I observe is that you must go backward oftentimes in life when you have transitions before you can go forward. So now let me anchor, hopefully, in your heart, in your head, that in contrast to the past, you witness how oftentimes we often want to say goodbye without hello. Think of how often, if you have a loss of most any kind, a way to kind of acknowledge this one is, if you have a loss of most any kind, it won't be much time go by before somebody approaches you and says, you need to say goodbye. And ultimately, yeah, we get to the goodbye or the acknowledgement of a reality of a loss. But to get there, there's a pathway of a series of hellos. And we culturally have kind of forgotten that. So we try to push you to goodbye too quickly. When if you go back, there'd be lovely illustrations of a series of hellos to ever get there. We historically always say hello to the acknowledging the reality. We kept the dead person around right in their own parlor. We befriended the pain of loss. We knew we had to say hello to that. We knew we had to say hello to shifting of relationships from presence to memory. That's why we would stop you on the street when you have mourning clothes on and say, oh, I see you had a death. Tell me about them. The list goes on and on. But my teaching point is I want to anchor for you. I help people each and every day do a series of hellos to ever get to the goodbye. And think about another example of that. One of the most commonly used techniques, premature, with a bereaved person is telling them to write a letter to the person that died, maybe go out in the backyard and burn it. Or I see the overuse early on, because remember, timing and pacing is so much of what you do to help another human, of the use of the Gestalt empty chair technique, where they'll say, well, say everything you wanted to say to your mother and then say goodbye. Please, we've got a lot of hello work to do before we ever get to that. What about the second one? You'll observe, I believe, that often we now want to experience light without darkness. Think of that inherent to some of the comments that are often well-intended, so always have grace. People don't do these maliciously. But think about how oftentimes people, in fact, say things like, be glad you had him as long as you did. You have other children. God wouldn't give you anything more than you can bear. I'm a person of faith, but nothing makes me crazier than the projection of theologized cliches toward the light when somebody's in fact in the dark. What about the person who says, well, he lived to be 89, or he lived beyond the average male life expectancy, as someone said to me when my father died at the age of 72, malignant melanoma. And one of my friends came over the next day and said, well, he almost made it to the average male life expectancy. Again, have grace. People know not what they do. But when you're in the dark, that's where you need to be. And you got some work to do to get to light. Think about that one about he lived to be 89. Isn't that comforting to the 88-year-olds in the room at the time? And the third one, my friends, you often now will witness how people try to push someone forward in grief without understanding the organic instinct to go backward. Our best teachers about grief, as a matter of fact, are children. They haven't been contaminated. So you'll see the 5-year-old whose mommy dies want to talk baby talk or wear a diaper again or do what we often call regress, which is a kind of a negative connotation. But what that is really an instinct to go backward prior to the loss or the trauma before in any way you go forward. But think of all the forward moving messages, got somebody for you to meet, put the past in the past. Think of the multitude, and maybe some of you want to give examples during our Q&A time of some of your own experiences with these three relationships. And again, I want to anchor, if you get these out of order, which you're at risk for, you can't create safe places of sanctuary and hospitality for the mourner. And you add to the epidemic we're witnessing of complicating people's ability to integrate loss into their lives. So one author said it best, Jane Walmsley, a European author not long ago, she said, the first thing you need to know about North Americans is they think death is optional. When that's the case, we're at risk for reversing those three relationships, trying to go around it instead of through it. What are some of the influences that impact the evolution of these paradoxes that I talked about? And again, what are they? Hello precedes goodbye, it's reversed. Darkness precedes light, and backward must occur instinctively before in life often you can go forward. When those shift, we have an inability to take that grief and convert it to mourning. Remembering again, the distinction is grief is the internal response to loss. Mourning is the shared social response or grief gone public. What are some of the contributors, if you will, to the paradoxes that I thought you might briefly take a look at to help us understand how this has evolved? One, we live in the world's first death-free generation. By that meaning that in the year 1900, for example, in both Canada and the US, in North America, over 1/2 of all deaths that occurred in the year 1900, people were 15 years of age or younger. Well, today, over 2/3 of all deaths in North America, people are 65 years of age or over. Now, we're glad there's been a mortality shift, right? I hope so, particularly if you're older than about 45 years of age, because in 1900, that was about the average life expectancy. And now we've seen a dramatic shift in that, where you may be 40 or 50, never even been to a funeral, you come naked to the experience of grief. That influences the shift in these three relationships because you haven't had prior experiences. Where historically you were more familiar with aging, illness, death, and grief. By the time you were 10 years old in the early 1900s, you've often been to 30 or 40 funerals. The children got the night watch during the period called the wake, where out of respect, we always stayed awake with a human body until we laid it to final rest. Now, interestingly enough, one of the most common media questions I get each week is, what age do you allow a child to go to a funeral? That was never a question in the early 1900s because children were always there. 8 cousins running around in the parlor, giving honor to grandma's body. As the older adults went to bed, they had the night watch during the period of wake. We live in a fairly fast-paced culture. I think we'd all agree with that, hyper living. The faster paced a culture gets, the more at risk it is for knowing there are times in life to slow down. One illustration of that is some communities are eliminating an element of ceremony called the procession. As someone will say, oh, it slows down traffic. Well, in fact, that is what a procession is in part, among other functions, intended to do, where people, for a few moments, let that procession pass and acknowledge that family is occurring, a major rite of passage. Let's give them respect. But again, I want to say, faster paced a culture gets, the more it lacks an understanding at times to slow down. And grief invites us to slow down. That's why we have acute symptoms like short-term memory loss and polyphasic behavior, where we have an inability to stay focused. The list goes on and on. Anhedonia, the inability to have joy in your life. All those acute symptoms are trying to slow you down. But if people come along and tell you to keep busy, collaborating with our fast-paced culture, or tell you it'd be easier not to have ceremony, for example, then you can get yourself in some troubles. We've disconnected from each other. One study showed 71%, I believe, of North Americans, several years ago, a study done, showed that over 70% of people don't know their neighbors in any really intimate, connected way. I guess a way of saying it is we moved kind of from the front porch to the back porch. People go in their garages, the door comes down. And that can contribute to not only these truths that I've talked about in form of introduction, but also to the one that you see here at the bottom, the deritualization trend, where if we're not gathering, there's some real intriguing studies. If you don't gather at other times as a family, you don't gather at holidays or for dinners or things like that, that often that same family, it's predictive that they may not gather when somebody in their life dies, which is a sad social comment. We value self-reliance. If you want something done right, do it on your own. And yet mourning, by definition, the shared response to loss, requires support systems. But if somebody internalized the thought that I have to do it on my own, they're at risk for over-isolating themselves and not experiencing a conversion of their internal response of loss into the shared social response, or grief gone public. Late 1960s, early 70s, across North America, we began to see the edges of the loss of death symbols, where people began to no longer wear mourning clothes as much as they historically had done. We began to see the edge of people not sending as much food, which is always critical because food is symbolic of love when words are inadequate. The ultimate death symbol, the body that animated life, that was the beginning edges of people lacking an understanding of why we'd spend time with that human body, usually for 2 or 3 days. And then it went down to 1 day, and then went down further. And then many people privatize. And again, we stay sensitive to cultural issues. If someone's Jewish, for example, they sit Shiva, great way of acknowledging the reality of death, activating support. So be careful with some of what I say here, and always keep it in a cultural context. But as you lose death symbols, which in part the function is to facilitate and invite people to take their grief and allow it to mourning, you see much more grief that can be carried and not have as much expression into mourning, which is how we perturbate or see change in movement or integrate loss into our lives. Another influence that we witness is what I term in my writings the deritualization trend, which is an academic sounding term that we're not having funerals as much as we once did. We're not using as many elements in ceremony. Where historically a family would receive friends prior and have the ceremony and ride in the procession and come back and share. We're seeing a chipping away at the various elements of ceremony, or many families are doing, in fact, what are called direct dispositions, whereby somebody dies and we get rid of them. Well, ceremony, I remind you, is a rite of initiation. It's not a rite of closure. Don't misuse that semantic. Oh, you had a funeral, so you had closure. No, hopefully, if you had a meaningful ceremony, anchored in the primary functions across cultures since the beginning of time, which are reality, recall, support, expression, and meaning, those help you reintegrate back into your community in a changed social status. But as we deritualize, Van Gennep, the man who coined the term years ago of rites of passage, said if you cut the bridge off to ceremony, you're in an ill-defined status and people don't know how to relate to you. Well, that's a major contributor to complicated mourning, because if I see you at the store and you're on aisle 2 and I decide I need to go down aisle 6 to get some Cheerios because you didn't have a ceremony which would have said to your community, please come and support me, then we contribute to carrying grief. Anyway, I can expand on any of these if any of you have questions about them, but I've written extensively about these factors that have influenced us at a socio-cultural level. I submit then that an essential part of caring is being able to learn ways to honor these 3 essential truths. I actually do a 4-day training specifically to those 3 truths and how to make sure we don't get them reversed. So here's a warning to you, and that is that training in traditional mental health, and don't get me wrong, I trained for 13 years to be a talk therapist. I value it, but I also got contaminated. I was taught to assess and diagnose and treat grief, but it didn't fit with my human experience. So training in traditional mental health applied to grief care can put you at risk for getting these paradoxes, or these 3 essential truths, backward. Well, you might say, I hope you will. How so, Alan? Well, here's some of the socio-cultural assumptions that have played into that. 1, North America is known for being preoccupied with the use of semantics tied to resolution or recovery-based models. And by the way, the etiology, the cause of that, the contribution to that came out of crisis theory, where in 1848, a professor drew a bell curve on the board and said, this is the model of homeostasis. And things come along in life and they knock you out of balance. And when they do, we teach caregivers intervention skills, which means to come between. We don't teach those at our training center, in an effort to reestablish the prior state of homeostasis. However, my friends, when applied to grief care, it doesn't work. I've never met a bereaved parent who's the same after the death of their precious child as they were before. So if we create models generating our helping goals around resolving grief, how inappropriate, how damaging. So we want to acknowledge transformative models, transformation, entire change in form, not try to get people back the way they used to be. So that's a socio-cultural contaminant, if you will. Another one related to semantics is you'll often hear people say, well, you need to let go. You have to have closure, as we previously mentioned. Again, unique to North American culture. And if you want somebody to instinctively hold on, tell them they need to let go. and they'll fight you every step of the way. As a matter of fact, that's why we saw many people move away from going to see mental health providers, and thank goodness in the late 60s, early 70s, going to support groups where they weren't told they needed to let go, and they could come next Wednesday night and say the same thing they said the previous Wednesday, and nobody said, you already said that, stop that, you need to let go. That's anchored in the awesome power of retelling a story, knowing something in your head that needs to be moved to your heart. So I invite you to consider letting go of the use of letting go or closure if you're a grief care provider. Often, sadly, we deny people forms of continued relationship. And when I say we again don't generalize, but oftentimes you'll see illustrations where hand in hand with telling people they need to have closure, they do inappropriate things like prematurely remove linking objects, come in and change the furniture around, tell people move, tell them to put the tape and take the pictures down off the wall. When go back, look historically, we always had more pictures up of somebody after they died than when we were alive. But now if you do that, somebody's bound to come over and say, oh, I see you've created a shrine, an inappropriate use of a word. Matter of fact, somebody did that after my mother died. And, oh, I see you've created a shrine. I have one picture of my mother in my living room. And I leaned back into them and I said, actually, it's a temple. Let me tell you about my mother, in an effort to use humor to help them understand the value, how death ends a life, not a relationship. What are ways we cherish and give honor to those that go before us? Many people lack an understanding of that and try to disconnect you from that relationship. You have to shift the relationship, I'll grant you that, from presence to memory. And how we do that is through doing, of course, what we often call memory work, going backward before you go forward. Another contaminant that we've witnessed, and don't get me wrong, we owe a debt to one of my mentors early when I was in my late teens and early 20s, had the pleasure of getting to know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and what a lovely lady who, through no fault of her own, wrote a best-selling book in 1969 called On Death and Dying, got us talking more in North America. We owe her a debt. So I get so upset when people kind of badmouth her as a person, because that wasn't her intent. She actually warned against projection of prescribing stages. And she knows, as many of you know, talked about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. In the mid-60s, she studied 198 people at the University of Chicago, and she developed a tentative theoretical model of stages. But she warned against being a grief buster, where you say, oh, this is what you're going to do in an orderly sequence. And yet many people, because it was so simple to understand, took that, in fact, became grief busters. And no matter what kind of loss somebody had, they'd go out and begin to prescribe what stage they're in. I still get referrals at my center to this day, where counselors will send me people and say, they skipped stage 2. We want you to get them to go through that stage. Anyway, that stage model often got combined with linear thinking. Matter of fact, in the US today, due to our Medicare, Medicaid guidelines, hospices are mandated to have an aftercare program for 13 months. How inappropriate, because that's tied to a linear model, when we in fact know, if you use models of research, that many people need more support 18 to 36 months after a death than they do in the first year, for various reasons I can talk about at length. So watch out about that contaminant, that there's orderly, predictable stages tied to a linear model, and you arrive and you're done. No, thank you. Another contributor in my observation is, historically, we didn't have clinical thanatologists like myself, and quite honestly, I'm not sure we needed them, because we used to have a communal embracing of people when they were in grief. People wore their mourning clothes. Even strangers, as I said, would approach them and say, I'm so sorry, I see you've had a death, tell me about them. And we'd invite each other to go backward in that context. And you were supported by your family, by your friends, and again, by your broader community. Over the years, grief began to be seen as some kind of individual experience. And then combined with that, we began to see more application of the medical model of assessing and diagnosing and treating. And why is that? When you lose an understanding of something culturally, you begin to think of it as somehow abnormal. And I think as we saw that shift, we saw a movement away from the communal experience. But of course, that was contributed to by those other factors I mentioned: world's first death-free generation, loss of death symbols, deritualization. Gosh, sadly, funeral attendance has over the years gone way down. It used to be people in the community, even if they didn't know somebody that died, out of their respect and modeling for transgenerational passing down, would get their kids and say, Mr. Smith, the barber died. We all need to go and support his family. And they'd take the kids that go right up to that body that animated life and tell some stories about him. And children learn that aging, illness, death, and grief were a part of life, part of living, part of loving. And the other thing I want to mention in that last bullet point is, again, I'm an advocate that grief is naturally complicated, and that we do need frameworks, as I've already said, and I'll go on to teach, to identify people who might benefit, should they so choose, from additional support and assistance. And I do think we need an element of advocacy to help people identify it. I have many people come to me in my programs and go, my goodness, I've learned tonight, Alan, you helped me understand I've been grieving, but not mourning. You've given me hope that if I mourn, and so forth. So be an advocate, don't just stand back. But I think when we lose an understanding of the normalcy of experiences, that we begin to use terms related to pathological, abnormal, atypical. And so these, my friends, are only a few of many socio-cultural assumptions that have impacted us as North American culture. Another one I've written about that I hope you might find interesting is, I call it kind of the North American resolution wish, that ties to that linear model. You see, we wish grief would resolve, don't we? We wish we'd wake up one day and it was all over. We wish that those painful thoughts and feelings were done. But that's not the way it works. There's no magical timeline. We'll have grief bursts often the rest of our life. Of course, many of you know the term grief burst. Some people use the word grief attack. I prefer grief burst. Attack sounds kind of pathological, if you will. You've been attacked. When you have sensory experiences, you hear something, you see something, you smell something, nothing more powerful. So years later, you see a car go by like your dad drove. Or I recently, my good grandma, I had two, one good one. That's a whole separate seminar. And one of my memories of my good grandma was that she would bake. And even if she ran out of baked goods while you were there, she said, it appears we just need more. We don't need to check your cholesterol level or sugar levels or anything. So she died when I was 15 years old. But now many years later, if I get out of my car in front of a bakery and I smell that smell, that's all it takes to have that lovely heightened sense of that wave of grief. So whenever we use linear models to think we shouldn't have emotion around a loss, we end up, again, inviting people to have complications and wonder whether, in fact, in lay terms, they'll often say to me, I think I'm going crazy, when in fact, they're not crazy. They're beautifully giving attention to the need to acknowledge someone in their life that's gone before them. Nothing better than a good grief burst, by the way. That's the way people who go before us often say, don't forget me, don't forget me, don't forget me. Let's take a few minutes to talk a little bit about terminology, because semantics are important. As I said earlier, Voltaire beautifully once said, if you wish to converse with me, define your terms. In the book you'll all receive, and I can't thank your hosts enough for providing my book, about when grief is complicated to you, as part of this conference. You'll be able to read about, in more technical detail, where I summarize the history of the evolution of perceptions of complications around grief. And over the years, various terms, I remind you, have been considered. Abnormal grief, chronic grief, morbid grief, pathological grief, persistent complex bereavement disorder, and then highlighting the one that this next month comes into play in the DSM is prolonged grief disorder. So these are semantics that have been used historically, but also currently the one that's now going to be introduced into the mental health literature as a formal diagnosis. I prefer and use the term, and have in my 40 years of companioning people in grief, complicated grief. Why is that? Thank you for asking. Well, I use it because to me, it more closely aligns with my understanding of the experience. Grief by its nature, one, is complicated. It acknowledges that grief has encountered especially high hurdles of one kind or another. And to me, it's much more hope-based. Hope, an expectation of a good that is yet to be, my favorite definition of hope. So I love it when other therapists refer people to my center, because I specialize in this. And so even that little 9-year-old who was referred to me at age 39, yes, his grief was complicated. Wouldn't that make sense? He's 9 years old, his mom dies, he's told not to use acknowledging how she died, the word suicide. There's no ceremony to initiate mourning. All linking objects are getting rid of. Dad remarries. Yes, his grief was complicated. But I firmly do believe that I have hope, an expectation of a good that is yet to be, that I was able to take that 39-year-old and go backward and help him do some what I call catch-up mourning to help uncomplicate things that were complicated at the time. So yes, I use the term complicated grief. And yes, grief is naturally complicated, but I'll give you some ways that I use a framework to develop care plans to say this is someone, if they so choose, that would benefit from help. I'm responsible to people, by the way, not for them. I love to help people identify they may need to give additional attention to grief, but ultimately they must make that decision. It always makes me think of that analogy of a lighthouse. The lighthouse doesn't run up and down the beach trying to find boats. It stays steady, it shines bright. Think about that. You're responsible to people, not for them, but do things like this. What a lovely educational opportunity to inspire ourselves to learn more about this so we can get the help to people that they need and that they deserve. So there's nothing wrong with them. They simply need compassionate understanding and gentle guidance to get back on track, remembering that many times people are invited off track. Think of the constant use of cliches when people are in acute grief, that instead of inviting them to move toward grief, invite them to move away from it. Carry on, keep your chin up, keep busy. Again, God wouldn't give you anything more than you can bear. One door closes, another one opens. The list goes on and on. So when people are invited off track, we shouldn't be surprised that it can complicate their ability to give attention to what they need to encounter in ways that help them integrate it and come not to resolve grief, but to reconcile, which I'll speak about. Reconcile comes from Middle English. It means to make your life good again. And if you mourn well, you can live well and you can love well. So let's talk about the metaphor of the use of the concept of the wilderness of grief. For a number of decades now, I've had the privilege and honor of speaking and writing about grief as a metaphorical wilderness experience. And I remind you, it is a metaphor, and I hope you're all with me. Time magazine misquoted me a few years ago when they said, Dr. Wolfelt said you should go camping, which I find interesting. Maybe it'll give birth to a new book I'll pen on camping your way through grief, as a matter of fact. I don't know. That'd be a good analogy. Anyway, I have found that metaphor, this metaphor of how grief throws us into this wilderness, that grievers, they can understand and they can relate to that. And I'm going to be using it in my time with you here today. So when we think of grief as an arduous journey through a vast, inhospitable, mountainous forest, we capture some of the essence of the normal and necessary experience of grief. Traversing grief, encountering grief is by its nature challenging. It's complicated. Matter of fact, it reminds me, somebody recently said, why'd you read that? Why did it take you so long to write your book on complicated mourning? And I said, well, because it's complicated. It did. It took me, later in my career here, 2 years of time in my writing hut, writing this book that thankful to your hosts that you'll receive, because it is complicated. So anyway, traversing grief is challenging. We don't always know where we're going to go. It's easy to lose the trail. We often encounter dangers and obstacles that we weren't expecting along the path, along the way. We can't control the forces that swirl around us. And yes, sometimes we do in fact get lost in the wilderness. We need people to help us. And by the way, I live in the mountains of the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, and we often have people visit from the flatlands. And we say, if you go out there into the wilderness and you get lost, hug a tree. Most people instinctively, unfortunately, don't. They wander around, making it harder to find them and get them the help they need. So do remember the general wilderness principle of, even in grief, that when you get lost, stay put. Breathe in and breathe out is something I say commonly to people early in grief. Not carry on, keep your chin up, keep busy. You might need some structure, by the way, but the worst, most trite thing people are told in grief is keep real busy. Guess what happens if you keep real busy? You'll get lost in the wilderness and you'll grieve, but you won't convert into authentic mourning. And I assure you, by the way, I'm going to teach you more about the foundation of understanding how bereavement initiates grief, and grief must then convert into active, authentic mourning. So companioning others in grief is not unlike, if you will, search and rescue. Well-trained people, knowing they never arrive, don't become an expert, but have given attention to that mysterious body of knowledge that we ponder, We get called upon, a privilege, to assist when we are alerted that a griever is struggling in the wilderness. It's our honor then to join them, to meet them where they are, to know they're doing the best they know to do, and to hopefully be able to accompany them back to safety. Remember, safety is a precondition for mourning. If you don't feel safe, you'll grieve, but you don't mourn. Remember my Dr. Allen's rule of thirds. When you have a loss in your life, you can split people in thirds. It relates to the concept of safety here. A third of people are neutral. They don't necessarily help you or hurt you. They say things like, oh, if you need me, call me. They're out of there. You don't hear from them again. They don't hurt you, but they don't help you. Another third of people, sadly, will actually damage you. You'll feel worse. They'll tell you to carry on and keep your chin up. They'll avoid you. They'll do things that ultimately kind of make you feel worse in their presence than you felt before you were with them. And then what we want to aspire to is being the helpful third or the therapeutic third, but that requires knowing conditions of safety for mourners where they'll convert grief into mourning. So while it's not the grief companion's role to carry, to lead, or to find the way out, it is our responsibility. It's our privilege to bear witness, to provide shelter, to offer sustenance, to have a toolkit, if you will, to help facilitate mourning, to safeguard their vital signs, and I firmly believe to imbue hope, which requires we do our own work, because you can never take anybody any further than you go yourself. I just helped a hospice remove a bereavement coordinator who was more depressed than the people she was seeing. That's generally not therapeutic. And what it was about is not doing your own work. So watch out for that principle that says, oh, the best way to help everybody else, or help yourself is to help everybody else. No, there's a reciprocal relationship that will ultimately help you bring hope for healing to other human beings. And that is knowing there are times in life when you yourself need to receive, which right now in the face of the pandemic is so true for many caregivers who've been giving their heart out. So there's sections in the resource you'll receive where I define more about what does it mean to bear witness? What does it mean to provide shelter so that people feel safe? How do we offer sustenance in the context of our helping relationships? What tools do we need in our body of knowledge? How do we safeguard vital signs early on when people are in acute grief and they need to help them in very practical ways? And most importantly, my friends, how do we do our own work so we come out of darkness to light with our own life losses, so that as a quality, that person can feel hope from us? And again, I want to say it one more time, hope, an expectation of a good that is yet to be. Because remember, if somebody comes to you and they're in the dark and they're early in grief and they have downward movement in their psyche, they're doing soul work, don't mismatch that. Last thing a mourner needs is a cheerleader. They need quiet, stillness, and hope from you that they feel safe and wish they have more time to spend with you, actually. They'll often say that. Well, some people get lost in the wilderness of their naturally complicated grief. That's what a part we're here to acknowledge and provide you a framework for understanding. We as caregivers have then the honor of helping them find safety. And to me, that's search and rescue of the human soul. Thus, this important, if you will, introduction to the topic, to inspire you to want to, of course, learn more, because that's what good education is about. We come together at conferences and we often say the mediocre teacher tells, the good teacher explains, and a really good teacher will inspire you. So I hope in some way to inspire you to want to learn more about this, because our challenge is we have more people with complications of grief than we have had the opportunity to give people body of knowledge and knowing how to help. So think about it. If this something resonates with you, get additional training so we can provide the safe places that people need to mourn well. So now introducing the categories of complicated grief, acknowledging that we're more than an hour in now. And what I may do, if it's appropriate, is teach another 10, 15 minutes, maybe do a little Q&A before we go to the 15-minute break at the bottom of the hour, and then come back and make sure I leave time in that second segment, because this is a lot of information, I grant you, in a short amount of time. And I want to give you the opportunity for any clarifications, questions, something you might want to teach. Makes our learning much more meaningful. But you can probably tell I could lecture for 3 weeks on this topic and not run out of things to talk about. Now, let me introduce the categories that I use that only as a framework to help me create a care plan for what I'm going to do to assist somebody. So I use them for that purpose. So I talk about grief gardening with people. It may sound soft. I don't care. It works for me. I get into the compost of one's life and they teach me, and I share everything back with them in terms of my understanding of what they've taught me and how there's been some complications they're experienced. And I very openly share the care plan with them. So as a first step, let me introduce to you, my colleagues, the model that I use, inspiring you to learn more, around unembarked, impasse, off trail, and in camp grief, knowing they're not mutually exclusive or all inclusive. There's another large subcategory of carried grief that kind of interfaces with unembarked grief that I'll talk to you about a little bit as well. So using the Socratic method of teaching, let's bring each one of these up, talk a little bit about it. Then we'll take a look at where we are in our journey together and see if you want to pause and do Q&As. If not, I'll keep going till 10:30 and we'll take a 15-minute break and leave time at the very conclusion. So unembarked issues of loss are where somebody's had a loss that's never been allowed, if you will, to depart the trailhead, using my wilderness metaphor, or to enter the normal and necessary wilderness of grief, if you will. Let's think of our, matter of fact, think of our 9-year-old that I opened with. This is just a brief illustration that I had the honor of working with, referred to me at age 39 by an employee assistance counselor who wasn't sure what to do with him, but was able to identify he needed to go backward and give attention to that. So when he was 9, mom dies of suicide. There's an inhibition in a closed family system of converting grief into mourning. So he's grieving. He has all this internal response to loss that he's carrying. And by the way, he had a classic triad of a grief carrier. He had low-grade depression throughout his life until it went into major depression in his late 30s. He had difficulty with intimacy because every time he'd get close, he couldn't consciously know it, but he's fearing replication. The most significant person in his life, his mother at 9, dies by suicide. He fears if I get close to others, they may go away as well. So unconsciously, even though he wants to get married, you see a pattern where he gets close and then he finds something wrong with them. If you look long enough, you can usually find something wrong with someone, by the way. And the third part of that triad, from his unembarked converting grief into mourning, was self-treating through addictive behaviors. In his teens, alcohol, then got treatment in the mid-20s and then converted it into work addiction. And then finally, as I say, grief will keep trying to get your attention until you give it the attention it deserves. In his late 30s, he goes into a clinical depression. His workplace cares enough about him and gets him the help where we can go back and help him do catch-up mourning, which I am honored to help people do. So the incapacity related to unembarked grief mourning is where you don't convert your grief or your internal response into more active mourning. And the consequence of that is it results often in fallout symptoms or signals, again, a term I prefer, where the signals are intended to say there's something you need to give attention to. And until you do, it affects, of course, the quality of one's living. So if you have a life loss that's part of your journey and you grieve it, but you don't mourn it, I refer to that as unembarked. And so my role as a caregiver is to create a care plan where I always say it's never too late to mourn, by the way. I helped a 97-year-old do that who had losses when he was a teen recently. What an honor. Second subcategory, impasse. Well, that's where the griever takes a normal dimension of grief, or they struggle with that particular symptom or signal. There's a multitude of dimensions. Use that term instead of stage, if you will. Dimension of response to loss, right? Mentioned them earlier. There may be shock, disorganization, protest emotions. There may be regret review or elements of needing to go backward before forward, that context. Hallmark of grief, sadness. There's a multitude of dimensions of grief I'm going to walk you through, as a matter of fact, and distinguish normal expression of that dimension from where there might be an indication of needing to give it additional attention. Because remember, characteristics of grief and mourning naturally recursive and slow by nature. That's why I'm not a real advocate of just trying to get rid of symptoms. That doesn't work very effectively. So impasse grief is you take a normal dimension of grief, and instead of softening over time, it hardens, if you will. And the 4 common dimensions that'll be referred to me often by other therapists where they need help knowing what to do with it is, it's appropriate to have anger or protest emotions and grief. That makes sense. You're trying to get back what you lost that you value. There's all sorts of reasons people instinctively might be protesting in the face of loss. That's pretty spiritually intelligent, actually, often around sudden traumatic death. But some people get mad and they stay mad, and that affects the quality of their living. I just had a referral of 12 years ago death of a child for a man who's lost jobs and relationships, and his anger just makes it impossible for him to function. So now that's affecting the quality of his life, and he has what I call impasse experiences with grief. Anxiety is a normal manifestation of grief. All these things are, but again, if it doesn't soften, C.S. Lewis beautifully said years ago, first line of his book, A Grief Observed, a classic, I did not know that grief felt so much like fear. So we know that anxiety is a normal component of loss, but if somebody evolves into panic attacks, for example, a very common referral from primary care providers to me over the years has been they rule out organic causes for the panic attack. And what a great meta communication that says there's something in my life that's keeping me from going forward until I go backward. So I love to help people who have impasse grief related to anxiety, where they're needing to do more backward work. Often they're people who've been pushed forward prematurely or projected that onto themselves. Of course, depression is a common hallmark of grief. Sadness, being pressed down, doing what Carl Jung beautifully defined as soul work in the helping literature years ago. But some people have pre-existing clinical depressions or other subcategories of depression, or some people because of trauma will have biochemical changes that we have to acknowledge can cause clinical depressions. And so that requires differential diagnosis and appropriate help. You could, if you take somebody who's clinically depressed and put them in a support group, that's generally not going to make much difference unless we also look at the special needs that that person might have. I love to teach primary care docs the differential diagnosis beyond just endogenous signs of depression, because normal grief mimics clinical depression, sleep disturbance, eating disturbance, mood disturbance. That's a classic triad, but requires much more understanding. Guilt, the gift that can keep on giving for some people, if you will. I say that with a little humor, but I have such empathy for people who go beyond normal regret review where they get self-punishing and feel guilty. So these are the four areas in impasse grief that I will often find where there's a lack of perturbation or change in movement, where somebody might need additional help giving attention to that and why they feel in lay terms kind of stuck, impasse grief. Off-trail grief, again, using my wilderness metaphor, is where behaviors are essentially avoidance patterns. And again, we never shame people. People are doing the best they know to do. But be very careful with the use of these subcategories of off-trail grief, because often there's elements of them that are functional. Somebody works to have some structure. But here's the key. If they're to the exclusion of any mourning getting into an off-trail pattern where they don't relate it in any way to the loss, there's not a conscious awareness of it. So some of the subcategories I've written about in the literature are the replacer, the person who marries the neighbor lady 3 weeks later or 4 months later or 6 months later. And you got to mourn what you've lost before you can reattach, right? And so again, have empathy for people. I just did a consultation of a man who fell in love with his hospice nurse, natural transference, you're nurturing and so forth. Anyway, the overworker, the person who throws themselves into work. I just had a man brought in on a stretcher who 18 months after the death of his wife was told by everybody, keep busy. Well, I told him he's a good candidate for counseling because he listens to people well. But sadly, what he did is he started working 18 hours a day, 12 to 18 hours a day, come home a few hours, go back to work. He collapsed and was brought into my center on a stretcher. He wasn't doing any mourning. He was grieving, but not mourning. I said, how you doing? Not very well. I'm laying here on your floor. I go, well, it's good to get to know you. Let's work together and see if we can give you some help. Some people shop their way through grief. All of a sudden, they've lost meaning and purpose in their life. And if they're not actively mourning and they're grieving, unconsciously, it doesn't mean anything to go through large sums of money, which is so sad and so tragic. Some people eat their way through grief as an off-trail response. There's actually a body of research that if you don't give attention to stress that occurs in your life, demand, challenge, and change, that appetite centers of your brain are impacted and you eat even when you're not hungry. So I've had a number of people referred to me who will gain weight after a loss. More commonly, about 80% of people will have temporary weight loss. But in my 40 years of experience, there's about 10% of people at risk for getting into a pattern where they overeat, and we can help them with that. somaticizer, fancy sounding term for kind of physiological preoccupation to the exclusion of mourning. These people are often doctor shoppers. They're in quite frequently. You help them with their stomach and they're back the next week and their knee hurts. You help them with their knee and then they come back and their back hurts. And again, I don't mean this judgmentally. It's just that it's a classic form of conversion where if I'm not doing what I need to give attention to, your body will talk to you. So somatization, multiple vague physical symptoms without any organic ability to diagnose, if you will. So that's another off-trail grief pattern we sometimes see where we want to get somebody help. Of course, some people get off trail through chemical abuse or dependency. It's one of my most common referrals where somebody comes in and they're already in that pattern and that arrests capacity to convert grief to mourning. So then I got to get them into active recovery with chemical use before we can actually help them do that active, authentic mourning. What about the intellectualizer, the retired professor recently who came in and said to me, Dr. Wolfelt, what will be the intensity and duration of this experience? Well, I knew that, again, he's doing the best he knows to do. He's very bright. He thinks through things, but you can't think through loss. Many people try to use logic in the face of loss, but I always, when the timing is right, help them understand that mourning is anchored in love, not in logic. So some of what you're experiencing that you're attempting to do logically won't really help you integrate it, but you do that very slowly because, again, people are doing these things because that's what they've learned to do or been encouraged to do. And what about the crusader, the person who's been told, go out there and save the world, help everybody else, and they too quickly get involved in that without knowing that there's a reciprocal relationship. There are times in life we need, my friends, to receive before we can give. And us caregivers are generally, as you know, much better at giving than receiving. But we also need to know there'll be times in our life we need to take time out, pull back, breathe in, breathe out, do our own work of mourning before we can go on and help others. So if you too quickly get involved in that, it'll eventually catch up with you. It's okay to find meaningful causes, but don't do them 2 weeks after you have a loss in your own life. Slow down, search for meaning before you go on to infuse your life with meaning. So those are the subcategories that I've written about. That's not even an all-inclusive list that our society actually reinforces. Think about it. I've got somebody for you to meet. You need to keep real busy. Oh, I'll come over and we'll be happy. I'll take you shopping. Oh, we often reinforce these off-trail paths to getting people into complications with their grief. And then in camp grief, which is the smallest, in my experience, framework I have to use in creating care plans, but it does exist. Some people will refer to it as like chronic grief or something. I don't like that term. So again, semantics are important to me. I just say your grief is kind of, it's coming, you're encamped in it. And what that operationally is defined as in my own model is that somebody has a persistent pattern of acute or intense grief that's kind of globalized in fashion, very different than in impasse grief where it's a particular dimension. This is where you experience continuous distress, commonly accompanied by symptoms of depression and anxiety. And essentially, I teach you that in my experience, many in-camp grievers have a real struggle with acknowledging the reality of the death. They're unconsciously, in part, trying to keep the dead person alive. But here's the thing. If you keep somebody dead alive, you become dead to yourself and the world around you. I often say death may not be the greatest loss in your life. The greatest loss may be what dies inside you while you live. And that speaks to how we want to not use judgment around any of these subcategories, only use them as frameworks for some people who may need to refer to somebody who has more experience in working with somebody. Again, my most common referral is for chemical abuse and dependency. I'm not an addictions counselor, but I know enough about it to know that it arrests capacity to mourn and get you actively engaged there. Some of you are grief support people, beautiful. Many people do well with that. But if you run across somebody, sometimes when people hear, particularly if they aren't comfortable with grief, oh, you work in the area of grief, and they refer people to you, and you don't have boundaries about who you work with and who you don't, you'll get yourself in trouble in some cases. So know when to refer. This is a framework that might be helpful to you. Now, having said that, I mentioned the possibility of some Q&A. Is that a possibility?
Dr. Wolfelt,
let's do that. Yeah.
If you would like to respond to some questions, we have a first feedback to you here.
Let's do that for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll take a 15-minute break and we'll come back and do a lovely, hopefully, second half for you, okay?
Great.
Thank you for having me.
The first feedback is from Benita Kitchen. She says, example of helping children to go backwards or even saying hello, say 5-year-old. Could you please give an example how you make a 5-year-old child go backwards before going forward?
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I think I mentioned that kids are our most natural instinctive mourners. And so I thank you for the question, but I would tell you, I don't have to make them. Kids instinctively do that. And that's an indicator of kind of what I call a flashlight behavior of the need to support them to mourn. So if you're 5 years old and you have a loss, you'll witness kids instinctively doing it. So I give that example because many adults, even though they start to regress, will question whether they should when it occurs across age groups. But kids do it more naturally. So I'm not forcing the 5-year-old to go back. They're going to come in and I'm going to learn they've been talking baby talk or having enuresis or having a hard time separating from a significant adult in their life. And we call those regressive behaviors, which again has negative connotation, when really that's intelligent, that's instinctive. That's part of that Kierkegaard teaching us years ago that while life must eventually be lived forwards, it's understood and given meaning to backward. So you allow for the backward as a meta communication about the need to create safety for that child to dose the needs of mourning. That child often needs help acknowledging the death at their level of understanding. They often need help in understanding the need to befriend the pain of loss, how appropriate it is. They often need help in doing memory work, shifting a relationship from presence to memory. They often need help in working on their new self-identity. They might say to me, am I still a big brother or something? Well, because their 3-year-old sibling has died. Well, then we work with that. So we can take the needs of mourning and apply them to that child and create safety for them, where our job isn't to stop the regression or even to think we have to initiate it. It happens instinctively. And I said that in passing because many adults will shame themselves when they find themselves going backward and they'll question or think they're going crazy. Why do I keep thinking backward about all the memories of my mom? And then we have to help them understand that 2 areas that you instinctively go backward with when you have a death are 1, the circumstances of the death, and 2, the history of the relationship. So, gosh, I could go on for my favorite topic is helping children cope with grief. Any child old enough to love is old enough to mourn. And they have a multitude of behaviors they use to teach us. And one of about a dozen behaviors we commonly witness in a bereaved child is the instinct to go backward. And we never want to shame. Many kids who regress get shamed by adults who think that they shouldn't be doing it. You're too old for me to have to tie your shoe. Tie it yourself, and they're 8 years old. Well, there's a threat to their safety and security. So you ask yourself and bring emotional intelligence to your helping that says regression is tied to a child viewing a lack of safety and security. Same thing applies to us as adults. There'll be times when there's threats to our safety, we instinctively go backward. Now we need people to empathize with that backward work, not try to push us forward. So that's a little response to that lovely question. And
thank you, Dr. Wolfelt. So now we have a reflection from Elizabeth Malachi. She says, it seems to be a blessing that people are now acknowledging the loss of miscarriage and baby loss. My mother-in-law grieved for 60 years and only openly mourned the loss just before dying. I had never seen this personally before her, so I wonder how many people grieve silently still.
Yes, and sadly, that's among the many kind of losses that are at risk for being disenfranchised, where people will say things to the miscarriage or stillbirth, oh, you didn't get to know them. But I remind us all, our attachment begins even prior to conception with our wish-for thoughts for our precious children. So we have a lot of empathy for miscarriage, stillbirth, infant death, what we call perinatal loss. And if you're working in that area, give attention to those ingredients around body of knowledge so that you are in the therapeutic third. The other thing that her question or comment reflects is mentioning how it wasn't until years later, prior to her own death, that she instinctively went backward. Robert Butler, a very well-known gerontologist years ago, talked about the application of integrity versus despair as you get closer to your own death, and that in an effort to achieve integrity, you go backward and do reminiscence work. And often when people carry grief, They'll give you cues that they need an opportunity to achieve integrity by being able to take griefs that have impacted their life and allow them to become authentic mourning. And that's what I think she experienced there as she described it. I didn't want to know much more, but prior to her own death, she's doing reminiscence work and naming her grief and acknowledging the need to mourn that. And doing so gives her a sense of integrity as she gets closer to her own transition. Otherwise, people go to their graves at times in despair because they've carried grief that they haven't been able to mourn. So in a broader context, any kind of disenfranchised grief, meaning it's not been acknowledged, allowed for, encouraged to convert from grief to mourning, when people are in later life, they'll often give you cues. Are you someone I feel safe with to go back and do what I call catch-up mourning so I have integrity before I make my own transition? Another excellent question. Thank you for that. Do we have time for one more or so before we go to break?
I think we have one last comment from Carol Latour before we break. She says, I received a referral from a psychiatrist for a gentleman who he believed has prolonged grief reaction. His loss was 6 months prior. I did make an attempt to educate the psychiatrist.
Well, I appreciate your comment. Again, part of our ongoing role is to educate and advocate. 6 months is a particular time when you often will see more a recursive nature of needing to befriend soul work. In other words, downward movement. And so we don't want to think of that as prolonged grief disorder. I personally disagree with the 12-month timeline that is being used and will become in effect in mental health in March, where you have 12 months, because many people are psychically numbed that entire first year or have what we call acute aftershock, secondary, sudden unexpected death, or various other things. And so when we start applying linear time frames and deciding it's now prolonged, that's often a projection of our perception that I'd like it better if you do this quickly and efficiently. I'd like you back the way you were. Now, again, what an opportunity to gently provide some information and education to that well-meaning psychiatrist, thank him for the referral, and then go on to help that person to more actively be prepared to now mourn in ways that maybe even prior to that time they weren't. Remember, normal grief mimics things like clinical depression. So if somebody goes in and is seen at 6 months and they're having sleep disturbance, either initial insomnia or terminal insomnia, they have appetite changes, more commonly 80% appetite loss, and they talk about mood disturbance. That's the classic endogenous triad that's often used to say, oh my goodness, this person is clinically depressed. But we need to know much more about that. That's why I've written an entire book about the differential diagnosis between normal depressive grief, a reactive loss, from various subtypes of clinical depression that do require specialized efforts to be of help. So thank you again for that lovely question, my friend, my colleague, related to how many times people might refer to you in the area of grief, where part of your role will be to thank them, to affirm the appropriateness of the referral when appropriate, and then maybe provide gently some education if they're open to it about learning why at 6 months, it could be very appropriate that this person needs some grief support, but it does not meet the criteria for prolonged grief disorder or even complications of grief. But then we have the privilege of helping that person mourn well so they can go on to live well and to love well. Again, I can't thank you enough for hosting me. I think that this is the time when we're going to take a 15-minute comfort break. It's hard to sit for any of us for 3 hours. So I submit that we'll take a 15-minute break at about this time and then come back together and we'll continue and talk more about, well, what do we do about all this? In the first segment, I've kind of used the principle of seek to understand. What a privilege to come back with you and talk a little bit more about what are the risk factors that we look at, acknowledge more about those subcategories, what is the model I use for creating care plans, all sorts of other interesting things that I have the privilege of being with you today. So thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to you to have that 15-minute break.